and podcaster Joe Rogan welcomed Twitter Files journalist Michael Shellenberger onto his podcast where they discussed the pharmaceutical industry's brainwashing of the left. Let's take a look.
The fact that no one has a problem with all of the different remedies that were effective against COVID being suppressed.
Right.
And that there was one narrative, and that narrative was connected to the emergency use authorization, which is only applicable if there's no other treatments.
Right.
The fact that this is not, that was never discussed, and the people weren't, but it's also the terror of this impending pandemic that's going to take out your loved ones. And, you know, Robert Malone talked about that on the podcast, that it creates this mass formation psychosis, that you have this one thing that people are looking at as the savior. And any suppression of that or any resistance of that, you are going to ruin my life. I'm trying to get back to work.
Right.
I'm trying to make society do the thing. And you can't even be like, hey, but maybe we should see studies. Hey, but where's the data? Hey, why are they telling pregnant women they can take it? There's no studies on pregnant women.
Here to discuss with us is Twitter Files author Michael Shellenberger himself. Thank you for joining us again, Michael.
My pleasure.
So our audience, I think, has a lot of interest in Joe Rogan and obviously the subjects he covers and the people he has on his show. I think there was a lot of skepticism and dissent and contrarianism on the subjects we talk about that's been healthily expressed on that show. What was the experience like of doing it?
Oh, it's such a pleasure. I mean, Joe, I think, is a national treasure. You know, it's not, you know, I mean, where else can you get 3 hours of being able to sit down with somebody with such a large audience? I mean, I think we don't appreciate enough how important that is. I mean, these issues are complex. And when we do shorter segments as journalists, we're always trying to do our best to summarize it. But you just need that longer format to get into the weeds and the complexities. So for me, I think Joe Rogan is a really important voice. I think that's why they've tried to cancel him repeatedly. It's very threatening. And I just think also, you know, we don't always get it right. And I think Joe and certainly me and many others, our views evolve. And I think that it's nice to have that kind of time and platform to be able to go through the ways in which our thinking has been changing, hopefully, and in most cases, I think, in response to new information.
Right. So they've tried to cancel him many times. They've also tried to cancel you. And most recently, even members of our Congress. You know, you're a guy who's was progressive, is on the left. What was that experience like of testifying before Congress about the Twitter files and having congressional members, Democrats, impugn your character and attack you in such a horrible, horrible way? What was that like?
You know, at first it's sort of startling because you're being insulted publicly, and that's just not pleasant to be insulted publicly. I don't think anybody enjoys that. But it quickly got so over the top that it became funny, and I think we started laughing a bit. I think I found it funnier at first. And by the way, it wasn't the first time I'd been insulted by members of Congress. I've testified about 8 times over the last 8 or 9 times, I can't remember, over the last 3 years. You know, at one point, I think a member of Congress made a sexual innuendo that I don't know that she meant to make, accusing Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, and me of being in a threesome. The whole room laughed. I then said there were many more people involved than that. The room laughed again. So I think there was some comic relief amidst the harassment, basically.
It's interesting to, we laughed at that here in the studio as well. I think it's interesting to see some of the ideological shift going on with people, people in the orbit of this show, people in your orbit. Joe Rogan, I think, supported explicitly, Bernie Sanders, at least in 2016, I think in 2020 as well, was someone I think who would have described himself as part of the populist anti-establishment left. But due to the shift that's taking place where kind of elite voices, elite expert opinion is now the more credentialed, the more well-respected by national security and health experts. That's all part of the Democratic consensus, which means the skeptics, the people who push back, it's not that they're necessarily part of the Republican consensus, but they're definitely not part of the Democratic consensus. So I think they're on friendlier terms almost with Republicans. So it's interesting to see someone like Joe Rogan, perhaps yourself, perhaps Matt Taibbi, perhaps Russell Brand, Bill, all these people who I don't agree with on lots of stuff, but raise interesting points, but are no longer welcome, would have counted themselves maybe as Democrats, but just can't be Democrats now because of where Democrats are on all these issues.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what you're describing is a real phenomenon where the people demanding the censorship, and I think people often waging these disinformation campaigns against accurate information, whether COVID vaccine side effects or Hunter Biden's laptop, these are elites, and they're reacting against a populist public, whether that's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. And that's the main dynamic. It's not a left-right dynamic as much as a top-down dynamic. I should say, too, for me, I mean, I graduated from high school in 1989. That year, the Supreme Court ruled that we had the right to burn flags. And that was something that progressives and Democrats were very happy about, as I was at the time. I think defending a very broad definition of First Amendment rights, for me, has always been a liberal position. I think we clearly see now the people that had suffered most of the censorship, that not all of it, were more of the populist right. And so you've seen more Republicans taking a stronger First Amendment stance than Democrats right now. But I do think that confusion around left and right becomes a lot less confusing when you understand that what you're really looking at is a kind of elite versus populist dynamic, where I just think ordinary folks want a lot more free speech, and they would like to be able to share their views on social media without being censored by people who think that they're better than them. And so I find myself annoyed by it, and I find myself, I have some pretty conventional liberal views on a bunch of things, including things like NATO and even things like vaccines. But when you start seeing, people engaging in censorship in such a snobby, elitist way, it's offensive. I think it's offensive to a lot of us. And I think it actually has the impact of making us rethink some of our positions, as it has for me on issues like Ukraine and on vaccines and on other issues where I kind of go, well, maybe I haven't really gotten the full picture either because of the amount of censorship that we've documented.
Right. It's so interesting. Like you used to think that things like free speech was like one of the most essential bedrocks of being on the left, right? Free speech, being anti-war, right? Being pro-tolerance for dissenting viewpoints, right? Like coming up, that's what it meant to be on the left. Right. Today, it's like if you don't believe in the consensus and the right of, like you said, these, over-credentialed elites to tell everybody else what's right, you're kicked out of the left, even if you still have all of those economic, populist views. I guess my question to you would be, do you think it's more likely that the Democrats are going to find their way back to representing ordinary Americans? Or do you think it's more likely that the Republicans will develop a robust economic platform that represents those people to match the more symbolic culture war areas where they are kind of where the working class is today? Or do you think neither party is going to represent these forgotten Americans and they're just going to be left out in the cold as they have been for so long?
Well, Bayou, well, those are really interesting questions. And, the thing about trying to predict the future is that everybody's terrible at it, and elites are often worse at it, and experts are worse at it than other people. But I definitely think the dynamic you're describing is very interesting, which is, if you love the First Amendment and freedom of speech, what do you do when the party that you've been a part of for all of your life is demanding that it be restricted on social media platforms? And the party that you had spent your life demonizing as the enemy of free speech is out there pushing for a much broader acceptance of disfavored views on social media platforms. So I don't know. I mean, but I have to say, I think your question is one of the most interesting questions in the world right now, which is the ways in which left and right are changing on these issues of freedom of speech, and the ways in which there is more of a changing alignment around elite versus populist. But I think it's a really open question. I mean, I think we have seen some Democrats, some publicly and some privately, express concern around the censorship. I mean, we saw Ro Khanna, the Democrat member of Congress representing Silicon Valley, reaching out to Twitter to express his concern about the censorship of the Hunter Biden laptop. So I do think there are some signs there. And I want to encourage the parts of the Democratic left that are advocating for broader free speech But mostly, I just think, for me, I'm much more focused on the short term, which is that we really need to defund the organizations that are funded by the federal government to advocate censorship. We need to dismantle the various government agencies, including the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. As far as I'm concerned, it should be shut down immediately. They've already started changing their website to remove references to domestic censorship efforts. I have a pretty big piece coming out today on one of the leaders of the censorship industrial complex for her role in spreading disinformation and advocating censorship. So I do think in the short term, I'd love to see as broad of a coalition as possible taking action to stop this broadening censorship efforts that we talked about earlier, including around Ukraine and Russia and Facebook, because it really is, anybody that's trying to save democracy by undermining free speech, you have to question their motivations.
Yes, and Republicans, I'm glad they're holding hearings on this that included you, included Matt Taibbi, need to do more than just hold hearings. They need to do exactly as you just said, actually defund institutions, curtail the power of various federal bureaucracies. It can't just be, oh, we're really upset that Trump was targeted or something. Like, it's got to be Americans' free speech rights are under siege here. Actually rein in this bureaucracy. Just don't whine about it when Trump happens to run afoul of it. That's something I would like to see from the GOP. Michael Schellenberger, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you guys.